Tetsuo is a friendless loser, with the social skills of a league player, and ever since he was a kid, every time there is another person near him, he always fumbles the interaction astronomically. In this world, monsters known as kaiju began invading Earth in 2025, so there was a race to develop weapons capable of defeating the kaiju without having to destroy an entire city in the process. Tetsuo's father, Dr. Yabusame, is one of the head researchers in the Anti-Kaiju Defense Force, and he's a bit of a nutcase who devotes all of his time to his robotics research, so he never bothered to take the time to teach Tetsuo how to handle social interactions. As a result, even when Tetsuo's classmates go out of their way to invite him to play with them, he doesn't know how to respond and ends up running away, so he's doomed to be a loner forever. On his way home, Tetsuo notices the new Snowball robot protesting for its rights outside the lab because Dr. Yabusame is trying to get him to blow himself up in order to take out a few kaiju. A few moments later, Yabusame walks up, and after hearing that this is all about his kamikaze plan, he lights up with pride, thinking this is one of his most brilliant ideas. By having Snowball dive right into the kaiju and blow himself up, they can cut the human casualties down to zero, so he's sure to get more funding for his projects now. The other scientists are a little concerned because Yabusame is completely ignoring the fact that Snowball doesn't want to do this, or that Ascension AI isn't necessary if it's just going to act as a missile, but hey, he's the one in charge here. Later on, alarm bells ring out through the city as a kaiju attack is announced, and Yabusame thinks this is the perfect time to test out the kamikaze feature on Snowball, so he orders his subordinates to prepare for launch. However, unbeknownst to them, Tetsuo has managed to sneak into the launch room of what is supposed to be a highly secured government research facility all by himself, and somehow no one notices as he climbs into the robot. Just don't think about it too much. After climbing into the manual cockpit of the robot that was designed specifically so humans wouldn't have to pilot it, he picks up the conveniently placed instruction manual for the robot and starts reading. After Dr. Yabusame is informed of this, he says there's no need to worry because those controls are way too complicated to operate on the first try. The kid would have to be a genius to figure out the manual in just a few minutes, but Tetsuo's league skills kick in. And would you look at that? A few minutes later, he has figured out the controls. He turns the power on and begins leading Snowball to the exit, but Snowball warns him that he needs to get out of the cockpit right now because his body was designed to blow up. Tetsuo assures him that everything is going to be alright because he plans to make sure Snowball doesn't have to die. He then initiates the takeoff sequence to fly off into battle, and a few minutes later, several kaiju have been taken down faster than ever before. After the battle is over, Tetsuo is hailed as the savior of humanity because of his unparalleled piloting skills, and while he would normally get in trouble for essentially stealing expensive tech, that would be bad PR. So instead, Yabusame announces that Tetsuo will become an official combat pilot, and that also means that Snowball won't have to blow himself up anytime soon. Snowball thanks Tetsuo for saving him from destruction, but Tetsuo can't really hear him right now because he's having a panic attack over the fact that he's the center of attention now. Over the next few years, Tetsuo becomes a national treasure for his heroic battles against the kaiju, and as more time and money are put into backing him, Snowball gets upgraded more and more. 10 years go by like this, and Tetsuo is now a teenager aboard one of humanity's space colony ships. He is still just as famous as he was back on Earth, but he still lacks social skills, so he has been trying to read books on how to make friends. Unfortunately, that hasn't been going so well for him, because when he runs into a group of engineers his age, one of them wishes him luck on his next battle, and the best response he could come up with was, and this is a direct quote, "I'll best my due." The girls don't know how to respond to that, and Tetsuo is so embarrassed by his fumble that he runs off to an airlock and flies out to Snowball. Snowball can already tell by Tetsuo's reaction that he fumbled yet another conversation with a girl, and the poor dude is on the verge of dying from embarrassment. He was trying so hard to act normal that he wasn't even thinking about the words that were coming out of his mouth. This is what you get when you spend all your childhood fighting kaiju instead of learning how to actually communicate with other people. And now, the only person he can hold a normal conversation with is Snowball, which is sad considering that he's a robot. Just then, the commander of the ship calls in to debrief Tetsuo on the details of the upcoming mission. Right now, they are heading to the kaiju nest with the goal of taking them all out once and for all. Once they arrive at the nest, Tetsuo and Snowball are meant to break away from the ship to distract the kaiju and buy time for the main ship to set things up. Then, when everything is ready, they will launch the omnidirectional infinity laser, which will kill all kaiju in the area at once. The only way the plan will work is if Tetsuo and Snowball are able to keep the kaiju preoccupied and lead them to their demise, so the commander says she's counting on them. Snowball promises to do his absolute best, but when it's Tetsuo's turn to say something, He once again fumbles and says a bunch of gibberish before ending the call. Tetsuo is once again freaking out over his absolute lack of social skills, but there's no time to fret over something like that, because a horde of kaiju have begun their approach, and every single one of them is huge, so it's time for Tetsuo and Snowball to get to work. They deploy 7 laser swords and begin slicing right through the kaiju, which amazes the cabin crew, and the commander would expect nothing less when they've got someone as impressive as Tetsuo on their side. While Tetsuo is keeping the majority of the kaiju away, the ship's shields are blocking the attacks from the rest, which buys them enough time to prepare everything. So once they are in position, they begin charging up the Infinity Laser. However, just when they are about to fire it, the laser systems suddenly go offline. Everyone is stunned by what just happened, and the technician tries to reboot the laser, but to her horror, the entire weapon system is down for some reason, and she can't get it to respond. This is terrible news for their mission, but the commander hasn't given up hope yet, so she tells everyone that they are switching to Plan B. As soon as they can get Tetsuo and Snowball back on board, they are going to retreat. However, just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, the entire ship's systems go down, including all the shield generators. And a look of horror washes over the commander's face as she realizes that this means they are basically sitting ducks out here. A few moments later, a giant kaiju rams headfirst into their ship, and with the shields down, it tears right through the bridge of the ship, spelling doom for everyone aboard. Tetsuo is still busy fending off a horde of kaiju when he notices the ship going up in flames, and he is horrified because he has no idea how the mission could have failed so badly. With the ship in such a state, it looks like everyone aboard must have perished, but Tetsuo still wants to go back, because if there's even a single person who managed to survive, then he wants to be there to save them. Snowball tries to tell him that the chances of anyone surviving that kind of damage are astronomically small, but Tetsuo tells him that their mission is to take out these kaiju, and until that's done, he refuses to give up hope. Snowball understands, so together, he and Tetsuo begin slicing through the kaiju horde, trying to wipe them out for the sake of humanity. However, even though they manage to take out quite a few of them, even after several hours of fighting, there are still countless kaiju remaining. And to make matters worse, Snowball has been heavily damaged, and Tetsuo is absolutely exhausted, so it doesn't look like they are going to last much longer. Now, Tetsuo has officially given up because he knows he did the best he could. The only option remaining is to initiate the self-destruct protocol and blow the kaiju up while they are all still gathered around Snowball. Tetsuo didn't want it to come to this, but he understands that there's no other way, so he's prepared to do what's necessary. Snowball begins taking more and more damage from the kaiju as time goes on, but they've still got some time before they need to self-destruct, so the two have one final chat together. Snowball mentions that his only regret is the fact that he never got to see Tetsuo make even a single friend. Tetsuo yells at him because he really doesn't want to be reminded of his social awkwardness when he's about to die in a few minutes, and besides, he doesn't care all that much about having friends because it doesn't matter as long as he can be with Snowball until the very end. Snowball asks him if he's sure about that, because there's no way he has no regrets in his life, but Tetsuo is serious about what he said. At first, he did make real efforts to spend time with other kids his age, but it never worked out because he didn't know how to approach them or ask to be included, so he spent most of his time alone. However, that all changed when he became the world's savior. Overnight, he started getting so much attention that he had no idea how to handle it, and that, in turn, made him shut himself off from the world even more. Eventually, he stopped caring about making friends altogether, but it's okay, because at least he got to spend his life with Snowball, so he's thankful for that. Hearing that from him makes Snowball feel extremely guilty, because everything he currently has is all thanks to Tetsuo taking a chance on him. He turned what was originally supposed to be an autonomous bomb into what he is today, and Snowball still owes him a great debt for that, so he can't let Tetsuo's life end like this. Snowball proceeds to lock Tetsuo out of the controls just as he is about to initiate the self-destruct sequence. He tells Tetsuo that he's guilty of a crime, and that crime was taking advantage of Tetsuo's kindness and robbing him of 10 years of his youth, all so he could feel important. Tetsuo tries to tell him that that's not true, because he was the one who chose to do all this, but even so, Snowball still feels guilty, so he plans to make up for it by ensuring that Tetsuo survives this, no matter what. And he does this by preparing an escape pod and launching Tetsuo back toward Earth so he doesn't get caught up in the self-destruction blast. As Tetsuo flies farther and farther away, Snowball tells him that his last and greatest wish is for Tetsuo to make it back to Earth and live a normal and happy life after making lots of friends. Through tears, Tetsuo promises to do his best to make Snowball's dream come true, which Snowball is glad to hear, and a moment later, the transmission cuts out as Snowball self-destructs, taking out the kaiju with him. The next time we see Tetsuo is after he has made it back to Earth, and his escape pod releases him from cryo sleep. According to the monitor, he is currently in Tokyo, Japan, and he has been in cryo sleep for approximately 8 years before making it back to Earth, which is shocking news for Tetsuo because, adding that to his 10 years on the original space mission, he has been away from Earth for a total of 18 years. He has no idea how he is going to relate to people now that there's an 18-year gap between him and the people he used to know. He's worried that it's going to be even harder for him to make friends than it was before. He thinks he's going to have to spend a few years as a shut-in until he can figure out the instructions and outs of life on Earth again, but evidently, he doesn't need to worry about that too much, because while he was gone, the world was completely covered in ice, so he may very well be the last human on Earth right now. Tetsuo can't believe this is really happening because there's no way he can fulfill Snowball's wish if there are no people left for him to befriend. He tries to stay positive because it's possible that the ice is only in this part of Japan, so there might be other spots on the planet where there's no ice. But when he pulls up the footage the pod captured on re-entry, he is mortified to find out that the entire globe has been frozen over, so there are no safe regions on the planet. He doesn't understand how this could have happened because, yeah, he was gone for 10 years, but that shouldn't be enough time to plunge the entire world into full nuclear winter. Tetsuo ends up sitting there for 22 hours because he literally doesn't know what else to do, but he is eventually snapped out of it by his rumbling stomach, so he gets up to go look for the escape pod's ration supply. However, as he does this, he accidentally turns on a message from Snowball, and at first, he gets excited because he thinks Snowball might have survived, but disappointingly, it turns out it was just a recording of Snowball's last words before he blew up. Hearing Snowball's wish for him to make friends one more time, Tetsuo realizes that he can't let himself give up so soon after returning to Earth, so he packs a supply kit, eats some rations to fill his stomach, and then he prepares to head out into the world to search for some people because he's sure at least a few humans must have managed to survive out there somehow. After all, his book says the first step to making friends is to go out and look for encounters with other people, so he needs to get to work. As Tetsuo begins walking, he is surprised by how much snow there is out here, but just then, he passes by a man sitting under a collapsed building, and he's startled because he didn't think it would be that easy to find someone. He attempts to talk to the man, but he ends up tripping over the excavator the man was sitting on, and to Tetsuo's horror, the impact causes the man's body to crumble to pieces. A few minutes later, Tetsuo holds a burial for the man who froze to death to pay his respects, and after that, he's about to continue moving, but then his eyes dart back to the excavator the man was sitting on, and it seems like it still works. So Tetsuo goes over to see if it still works, and by some miracle, the engine actually starts despite the conditions. Tetsuo begins driving across the wasteland with the excavator, and as he goes, he starts figuring out what the controls do, and he's having a lot of fun with this, but he ends up coming across a giant, almost man-made looking hole in the ground, and he wonders what it could be. However, he doesn't want to get distracted because his mission is to find some other people and make friends with them. Just as he's about to leave, he realizes that humanity might have dug the hole so they could move underground since it would be a lot warmer down there than it is up here. He is relieved that the possibility of other people being here is still alive, so now all he needs to do is call out into the hole to see if anyone responds. But he realizes that he's too anxious to yell down the hole because what if someone does actually respond? What will he say then? He sits down at the edge of the hole and starts thinking of what he should do next, but just then, he notices a shadow being cast over him, and when he looks up, he is shocked to see a kaiju standing right behind him. For a second, he thinks he's hallucinating, but nope, that really is a kaiju, so he hops on his excavator and starts driving away as fast as he can. However, he forgot there were giant holes nearby, so he ends up driving straight into one of them and falls all the way down to the bottom. By the time he wakes up, Tetsuo finds himself in the frozen remains of the city he once lived in, and he's relieved that it's all still here, but he's also sad about the state it's in. That said, he doesn't have much time to really mourn the loss of his home because the kaiju is still here, and it's coming for him, so he needs to deal with it. He pulls the excavator back onto its wheels, and as the kaiju approaches, Tetsuo prepares to fight it to the death. As it's about to attack, Tetsuo turns the excavator on and drives the shovel straight into the kaiju's mouth to keep it from biting down, which works for now, but he's getting pushed back, so he needs to think of a way to deal a finishing blow to this thing. He doesn't exactly have much to work with here, but part of what made Tetsuo such an excellent pilot was his ability to improvise, so he is able to come up with a plan fairly quickly. The kaiju isn't very smart, so it always charges in headfirst when it attacks, and Tetsuo can use that to his advantage. So he positions the shovel right in front of the kaiju's mouth, and as the kaiju bites down on it, the shovel begins to take on more and more damage until it eventually snaps off, leaving a sharp metal prong in its place, and this is exactly what Tetsuo had been waiting for. This time, as the kaiju charges forward, instead of defending, Tetsuo also charges forward, driving straight into the kaiju's mouth. But before the kaiju can bite down on him, the metal prong on the excavator pierces the back of the kaiju's mouth, stabbing all the way into its brain and killing it on the spot. Several minutes later, a group of humans who were out scavenging happen to come across the kaiju corpse, and they are really hyped because this will be a great source of food for their colony. But while they are still celebrating, Tetsuo suddenly claws his way out of the kaiju's mouth, and the people freeze in shock because they can't believe a boy just walked out of a dead kaiju's mouth, whereas Tetsuo is just glad that he actually managed to find real people after all. The people are terrified because they think Tetsuo is some kind of demon, and Tetsuo would like to talk to them. So he starts trying to plan out his conversation so he doesn't mess it up, but he can't really think of anything to say, so he hits them with the All Might smile instead in an attempt to set them at ease. However, that has the opposite effect because they think Tetsuo is creepy now. Tetsuo really wants to at least talk to them to get the ball rolling on becoming friends, but unfortunately, the fight against the kaiju took a lot out of him, so he passes out a few moments later. While he's unconscious, Tetsuo has a flashback to a time when Snowball was telling him to stop relying on books from a guy named Lonely Iwaki for tips on how to make friends, but Tetsuo tells him he has no choice because he needs to learn somehow. However, he doesn't think he's cut out for all this friend-making stuff because the only time people actually care about him is when he's fighting kaiju, so no one would ever want to be friends with him. By the time he wakes up, he finds himself lying on a mat in the cave with his hands tied behind his back. He wonders where the survivors he met earlier went, so he starts taking a look around, and to his surprise, he finds a whole group of humans currently hard at work dissecting the kaiju's body. He is elated to find out that there are still so many people alive despite the condition of the world, and he's excited because with this many people, at least one of them is bound to want to be his friend, so he prepares to go meet them. However, getting up is a little difficult when your hands are tied behind your back, so Tetsuo casually dislocates his shoulder to rotate his arms forward and unties himself. Meanwhile, the platoon chief is currently praising Ao for finding such a fresh kaiju carcass because this will feed the colony for weeks. But as much as Ao would like to accept the credit for this, she doesn't really want her name to be mentioned in the report since she technically wasn't supposed to be out here. After all, exploring a kaiju nest is extremely dangerous, and someone as important as her isn't allowed to put her life at risk in missions like that. However, even though the elders forbade her from doing this kind of stuff, Ah still plans to continue her explorations because the only way they can ever hope to defeat the kaiju is if they put in work to fight back against them. Just then, Ah's friends come running over in a panic and tell her that the guy they tied up earlier escaped somehow after waking up, and they don't know where he is. Meanwhile, Tetsuo is currently walking around the dissection site, watching the people as they work on cutting the kaiju up, and he notices two workers use some oil from the kaiju's body to light a lamp so they can see better, and that's when he realizes they must be harvesting resources from the kaiju's bodies. It makes perfect sense because with the world in an ice age, resources are unbelievably scarce. So they use the kaiju's bodies to gather and refine all sorts of daily necessities, and he's impressed by how resilient humanity is. Just then, a little kid runs by, and it looks like the kid is playing with his Snowball action figure. Tetsuo reaches his hand out to pat the kid on the head, but he hesitates for a moment, so the kid jumps to touch his hand instead. The kid then runs off to continue playing, but just then, Tetsuo notices a cracked icicle right above the kid's location, and it looks like it's about to fall any minute now. So Tetsuo needs to do something to save him before it's too late. There's no way he will be able to catch up to the kid at this distance, so instead, he grabs onto a long bone and uses it as a sword to slash the icicle before it hits the kid. The kid's father saw the whole thing happen, so he runs over to check on his son, and after confirming that Joji is okay, he thanks Tetsuo profusely because he doesn't know what he would have done if his son got hurt out here, especially when he has been warning Joji to be careful about the ice so much. Takamura's friends tell him to take it easy on Joji since he's still just a kid and doesn't know any better, and after that, they turn to Tetsuo to thank him as well. But then they realize that they've never actually seen Tetsuo before, which is strange since they pretty much know everyone in the colony already. They can vaguely remember seeing Tetsuo's face somewhere before, almost like he's supposed to be someone famous, but they can't quite put their finger on it. So they ask him what division of the colony he's from, and Tetsuo doesn't know how to respond to all these rapid-fire questions. Since Tetsuo hasn't answered any of their questions, the two of them are starting to get suspicious and think Tetsuo is hiding something from them. But to Takamura, it just looks like they are hassling the boy who just saved his son's life, So he smacks them on the head and tells them to leave the poor boy alone because he's clearly overwhelmed by all their questions. Frankly, he doesn't care who Tetsuo is or where he came from, because all that matters is that he's the one who saved his son. So he extends his hand to Tetsuo and formally introduces himself. Tetsuo can't believe he's actually getting a chance to talk to someone, and he doesn't want to mess it up. So as Takamura shakes his hand, Tetsuo works up the courage to introduce himself properly, which is the first complete sentence he has managed to say to another person in a long while, so that's a major achievement for him. Now that they've both introduced themselves, Takamura then tells Tetsuo to sit tight because he's going to grab the best cut of meat from that kaiju as a reward for him. Takamura's friends try to tell him that the leader is going to be mad if he gives away meat without permission, but Takamura says he doesn't care because this is a special occasion. Ao and the others also happen to see the whole thing unfold, and they had initially intended to recapture Tetsuo once they found him because they didn't know if he was a threat or not, but after seeing him rescue one of their own, Ao is convinced that he's a good person, so they can just leave him alone for now. However, just when things were going well for everyone, a giant hand suddenly reaches out from the shadows and grabs the head of the dead kaiju. The hand turns out to belong to another kaiju, and the sight of this thing has Tetsuo particularly shaken, because in all his years of slaying kaiju, he has never seen one like this before. The kaiju slams its hand down on one of the people, squishing them to death instantly before licking the juice right off its hands. And while everyone else is panicking, Tetsuo keeps a straight face and tries to think of a way to deal with the problem, but there really isn't much he can do. He doesn't have Snowball with him to fight. The excavator is already wrecked and he has no weapons to fight it with. No matter how he looks at it, the situation is pretty bad. But since the people here have probably dealt with this kind of thing before, he's sure they must know how to stop the kaiju. Never mind, they're just as unprepared as Tetsuo, so it's up to him to figure out a way to save as many of them as possible. One of the people gets so scared that he turns and starts running, but Tetsuo knows that kaiju react to sudden movement, so doing that will only make himself a target. He yells for the guy to stop, but it was too late because the kaiju had already raised its hand to squish him. And he most certainly would have died from this, but at the last second, Ao managed to push him out of the way and got him to safety. The guy profusely thanks her for saving his life, but Ao is just glad that he's still alive. She slams her head into the ice because she can't believe she let someone die on her watch, especially since she wasn't even supposed to be out of the colony in the first place. But her friends tell her there's no use in beating herself up over it right now because they've still got work to do. Ao swears that she's not going to let anyone else die, so she asks her friends to prepare all the emergency machines they carry for situations like this. They may not have any plans to defeat kaiju like Tetsuo had hoped, but they have at least created escape protocols to make sure everyone makes it out in one piece whenever there's a kaiju attack. Thanks to the fog, the kaiju has no way of spotting or striking at them. So everyone begins running out the rope ladder at the edge of the hole so they can make it to the surface and get away from that thing. However, just as Tetsuo was about to join them, he notices the kaiju bracing its body and opening its mouth wide. Even though he has never seen a kaiju like this before and has no idea what it's capable of, all his years of kaiju battle have given him a keen instinct for dangerous situations. And right now, those instincts are telling him that the fog won't be enough to keep the kaiju at bay. It might blow the fog away, or it might make a head-on charge for the latter, but either way, it will end with more people dying. And Tetsuo doesn't want to let that happen, especially not when he finally got around to talking to someone other than Snowball. So he makes the decision to use himself as bait and runs past the kaiju to draw its attention away from the others. They all yell at him to get back here before it's too late. But Tetsuo is already behind the kaiju at this point, and his plan clearly worked because the kaiju has stopped charging up its attack and is now chasing Tetsuo. That said, Tetsuo doesn't have many options when it comes to ensuring his own survival, so the best he can do for now is dodge the kaiju's strikes and hope he manages to find a hiding spot before it's too late. Unfortunately, the kaiju knocks some ice blocks loose, and one of those blocks hits Tetsuo from behind, so he collapses to the ground. If nothing is done, then Tetsuo is definitely going to perish, and Ao already promised that she wouldn't let anyone else die today, so she leaves her group and rushes over to try and save Tetsuo. Unfortunately, by the time she got to Tetsuo, the kaiju had already grabbed him and was about to eat him. But just before it could take a bite, the chips in Tetsuo's head begin reacting, and a moment later, the ceiling of the cave collapses as the escape pod comes crashing through and slams right into the kaiju's arm. After the initial landing on Earth, the escape pod began downloading a large volume of data from its backups, and 48 hours later, the download was finally complete. So it activated the defense protocol Snowball had set up in the event that Tetsuo's life was put in danger after he returned to Earth. The pod immediately locked onto Tetsuo's location via the chip installed in his head, and once it got a lock on his location, it activated its thrusters and launched itself into the air, heading right for him. As the pod made its way to Tetsuo, he began to hear the voice of Snowball calling out to him. And a few moments later, the people who had managed to make it to the surface saw the pod fly by before crashing through the ice, slamming right into the kaiju's arm, forcing it to let go of Tetsuo. As Tetsuo is falling through the air, he recognizes the escape pod, but he doesn't understand why it's here. This was a failsafe Snowball created that even Tetsuo had no idea about, and it basically ensured that even if Snowball's main body was destroyed, a copy of his AI would survive so he could stay by Tetsuo's side whenever he's in trouble. And now that he's here, he activates the pod's combat mode and extends its arms and legs while catching Tetsuo at the same time. And as he lands, he asks Tetsuo if he's ready to fight together again. 14 years ago, when Tetsuo and Snowball were still starting out as kaiju fighters, they would get called out on missions to defeat kaiju that were attacking the city. But Yabusame, Tetsuo's dad and Snowball's creator, couldn't care less about them personally. All he wanted was the combat data from their missions. He even forgot to give Snowball his routine maintenance and gave Tetsuo a cup of oil instead of water, and after the battle was done, he couldn't even be bothered to greet Tetsuo and Snowball after they got back. They both had to deal with Yabusame's neglect, and in a way, you could say they were brothers in that way, which is why Snowball became Tetsuo's first friend. For a long time, Tetsuo has had an emptiness in his heart that wouldn't go away no matter how much he tried to fix it. He would feel it every time he was reminded of how he was incapable of making friends, and the only thing that ever helped make him feel better was Snowball. The kaiju raises its arm and attempts to strike at Snowball, but Snowball sees it coming and jumps back just in time to avoid it before using his jet boosters to fly back and headbutt the kaiju, knocking it off its feet. Tetsuo doesn't understand how this is possible because he saw Snowball blow up with his own eyes, but Snowball explains that the moment before the blast, he managed to transmit all of his data along with his personality to the escape pod. It was a bit of a rush job, so the installation process took a lot longer than he thought it would, but it worked, so he's back and Tetsuo couldn't be happier because he finally has his first friend back. Just then, the kaiju manages to get back on its feet, but it suffered a lot of damage from Snowball's strike earlier because its arm has been broken, and all the pain seems to have enraged it. Snowball mocks the kaiju and tells it has every right to be angry, because now that it's up against him and Tetsuo, it is doomed, even if they don't really have any good weapons to work with. That last part gets Tetsuo's attention, so he asks Snowball if he seriously doesn't have any weapons, and Snowball confirms it. After all, this was originally just an escape pod, and it is mechanically inferior to Snowball's original design, so they are lucky that it even has arms and legs. It's not like it's Snowball's fault, since he was just working with what he had available at the time, but Tetsuo is wondering how they are going to stop the kaiju if they don't have anything to attack it with. Snowball says it will be fine as long as they work together, but that doesn't really answer Tetsuo's question, so he's still really worried. Meanwhile, all the survivors are currently wondering where that giant robot came from and why Tetsuo is talking to it. But Ao reminds them all to keep their distance because it's still dangerous to get near that kaiju while it's still alive. The kaiju suddenly plants its arms into the ice and begins tensing up its body just like last time, and at a glance, Snowball can tell that it's getting ready to attack, so he warns Tetsuo, and Tetsuo manages to pilot them out of the way just in time. As a result, the kaiju slams headfirst into the wall behind them, and Snowball is relieved that they managed to evade that strike because if that thing had hit them, they probably wouldn't have survived. The kaiju is already preparing to launch yet another attack, so Tetsuo tells Snowball that they need to come up with a way to fight back because they can't keep dodging forever, and he actually has something in mind. Meanwhile, as the people up top are watching the fight go down, they are starting to worry that Tetsuo might end up dying, but the squad leader tells everyone that he's sure Tetsuo will be fine. The others ask him how he is so sure of that, so he tells them to take a closer look at those two down there and reminds them that this isn't the first time they've seen this. Everyone turns to watch the battle closely, so they can figure out what the leader is talking about, and as the kaiju charges at the two of them, Tetsuo and Snowball brace themselves. Thankfully, they've come up with a way to attack the kaiju, so they activate a concentrated booster jet, creating a makeshift plasma sword for battle, and as the kaiju is about to hit them, they sidestep it and slice its head clean off its body in one swift motion. The sight of such an expertly executed maneuver reminds everyone of the savior who used to defeat kaiju for humanity years ago. And pulling off a move like that where there's almost no margin for error would be impossible for almost anyone. But the fact that Tetsuo managed to pull it off serves as proof to everyone here that he really is the hero from back then, and they are all overjoyed by this news. So they start celebrating because this could really turn the tide on their favor, But while they are busy doing that, approximately 100 kilometers away, there's a humanoid kaiju lying in wait atop a tower, and this one seems particularly intelligent, so it's bound to bring trouble in the near future. With the kaiju dead and everyone's safety ensured, the group finishes harvesting the body of the kaiju and begins heading back to their base. Tetsuo is really happy that he's finally going to get to meet more humans, since only a few hours ago, he was convinced he was the last human on Earth, and on that note, Snowball is still quite surprised to find out that Earth could change so much in the time they were gone. It has only been 10 years, and it's hard to believe that it's possible for an entire planet to freeze over so quickly. That's clearly what happened. Meanwhile, Ao's friends are riding on the truck in front of Snowball, and they think Snowball looks really cool, so they ask Ao what she thinks of him. But Ao already left a while ago to go talk to Snowball and Tetsuo. Once she gets up there, she places a can of pineapple in front of Tetsuo and says this is something they only have for celebrations, so she's giving it to him as thanks for saving their lives. Seeing another human in front of him, Tetsuo immediately begins fumbling the interaction again, but thankfully, Snowball is here to smooth things over. So he thanks Ao on Tetsuo's behalf and tells Tetsuo to quit messing around and talk to her already. Ao doesn't seem bothered by how weird Tetsuo is acting and tells him that pineapple is a bit of a delicacy these days because it's hard to come by anything that tastes sweet. And as she opens the can, Tetsuo can see the hesitation in her eyes because she looks like she really wants to eat the pineapple herself. He tells her he's not sure if he should accept something that's clearly so important to her, but Ao snaps out of it and tells him that she wants him to have it because if it weren't for him, all of them would be dead right now. So she wants to show him how grateful she is, but she asks him to hurry up and eat it before she loses all her self-control. If that's how Ao feels, then Tetsuo doesn't want to be disrespectful by refusing, so he agrees to accept the pineapple and takes a bite. However, even though she did say Tetsuo could have it, it still hurts Ao's soul to watch someone else eat pineapple without her, and it'd be awkward to just leave things like this. So Snowball suggests that Tetsuo could share the rest of the pineapple with Ao, and Ao is really happy to hear that, so she agrees immediately, though she's also ashamed by how little self-control she has when it comes to sweets. After Tetsuo and Ao are done eating, Ao tells Tetsuo that she didn't come up here just to give him the pineapple. She also wanted to get to know him, so she extends her hand and formally introduces herself to him, which makes Tetsuo really happy because this is the second friend he has made. Now that Ao is done with thanks and introductions, she moves on to a more serious topic and tells Tetsuo that she needs to inform him about what happened in the 10 years that he was gone for. He had been meaning to ask about that, and Tetsuo is a bit caught off guard since he didn't think he'd get that info so soon, but he has also been meaning to ask about it. So he asks Ao to go ahead with her debrief. She explains that 10 years ago, a kaiju appeared out in the water off the coast, and by this point, since Tetsuo and the other defenders had been doing such a good job dealing with all the kaiju and keeping casualties to a minimum, the people weren't particularly scared by the sudden kaiju appearance or the fact that this one looked humanoid and had a floating sphere trailing behind it. 2 mech soldiers were deployed to deal with the threat, and they were about to get to work, but all of a sudden, their suits began to get very cold. So much so that the soldiers inside began freezing, and it was all caused by the kaiju and its white sphere. Under its command, the white sphere began to multiply and spread through the city. And at first, it didn't look like the bubbles did much, but the second they made contact with something, they burst, releasing a sub-zero blast wave that froze everything and everyone nearby. And the same thing happened in other countries all over the world, so now, all that's left is this frozen wasteland. From what Ao just told him, Tetsuo believes the mysterious kaiju must have appeared literally right after he left the planet to destroy the kaiju colony. But he can't believe that a single kaiju was capable of causing so much death and destruction on its own. He asks Ao why Erde, the UN anti-kaiju organization, didn't do something to stop it, but its appearance and attack were so sudden that they had no time to prepare, and after the damage was done, they didn't have the resources to launch a counterattack, so instead, they focused on rescuing survivors, and since then, humanity has survived for years like this. Tetsuo is a little worried that Erde might have disbanded, but Ao tells him she has heard rumors that Erde is still around, and they apparently even have an entire base out there somewhere, so he might be able to find them eventually, and Tetsuo is glad to hear that. As time goes on, the group eventually gets close to Ao's home base, so she calls over to Tetsuo and tells him they are almost there. They walk through a giant crack in the ice and eventually come upon Nishima Mall, the base that Ao calls home. The building used to be a junior high school, and there are tons of people living here right now, so when they see the expedition group return with a giant robot, the news spreads fast that the savior has returned. Before long, a giant crowd is formed outside to meet Tetsuo, and seeing all these people makes him really happy, but he's also a little worried that they might blame him for being gone while the world was in danger. Fortunately, the people are smart enough to realize that it wasn't Tetsuo's fault, so they all greet him warmly and welcome him to their mall, and Tetsuo couldn't be happier right now. After they are done cheering, Tetsuo gets down from Snowball and Ao gives him a rundown of how things work here. The mall is a pretty big settlement, so there are around 200 people here and everyone has a job to fulfill. For some, their job is to leave the mall to gather resources outside, while others handle the infrastructure and business inside. Tetsuo thinks this is all so amazing, so he asks Ao what her department is, and she tells him that she works in accounting. Hearing that has Tetsuo a little confused, because he doesn't understand why Ao is out in the wasteland when she's in accounting, and that's the fun part. She wasn't supposed to be there. It's kind of forbidden for her to leave the mall, so normally she would have tried to sneak her way back in so no one would notice, but the elders have already found out, and they look mad. So Ao calls Furumachi and Shinjo, and tells them it's time to go get yelled at together. In the meantime, she asks Takamura to take care of Tetsuo, and Takamura knows the perfect way to get him settled in, so he takes Tetsuo to the mall's hot spring. Tetsuo can't believe there's really a hot spring here because it's the last thing he'd expect to see considering the fact that the entire world is frozen over. Takamura tells him that he reserved the place to make sure no one would bother them while they are here, so they all jump in. And Tetsuo is absolutely loving it, since it has been 10 years since he had a nice hot bath like this. But now that he thinks about it, he wonders where the mall gets the energy to keep a hot spring going in conditions like this. And as a matter of fact, he didn't think much of it earlier. But even though everywhere else is frozen, the mall is the only place where there's absolutely no ice. So there's definitely something going on here. Takamura can already tell that Tetsuo is wondering why the mall is so warm, so he informs him that it's because there's a kaiju living under the mall right now. Tetsuo freaks out a little after hearing that, but Takamura tells him there's nothing to be worried about because it's perfectly safe, and it's all thanks to the kaiju tamer who saved them. 11 months after the world had been frozen over, the group of survivors had been wandering the wasteland looking for a new place to stay, but the Nishima Junior High, which they had planned to hunker down in, already had a massive kaiju hanging out in the area, and that was their last hope, so they currently had nowhere else to go. Before that point, the survivors had been doing everything in their power to stay alive, and they had been gathering at emergency shelters, but whenever kaiju got too close, they were forced to abandon their temporary base and move to a new location, but their resources soon ran out, and once they were on the verge of death, they were left with no other choice but to eat kaiju meat. That meal ended up killing half of the survivors because their stomachs couldn't handle the toxic meat. Initially, some refused to eat it, but without food in their bellies, the cold was sure to kill them sooner or later, so before long, every last one of the survivors had eaten the meat. Of those survivors, Ao was in really rough shape because the kaiju meat was taking a toll on her, and one of the group members began suggesting that they might be better off leaving her behind. Ao's teacher refused to do something so cruel because she was his student, but Kashiki points out that they've already seen this kind of thing before, and if she has gotten sick from the kaiju meat, then it's only a matter of time before she starts coughing up blood and dies. Kashiki isn't necessarily wrong, but Takamura still thinks he's being a jerk for even considering leaving a child behind, so he's about to go beat him up. But just then, they all notice that the kaiju that was hanging out near the school isn't there anymore, and the next thing they know, it has appeared right beside them. They all start panicking and running away, but then a second kaiju appears behind them, so the group panics even more and flees behind a piece of ice for safety. They all think they are doomed since there's no way they can outrun two kaiju on foot, but they soon realize that the kaiju aren't chasing them. They are staring each other down, and if those two are about to fight, then they can use that distraction to escape. However, just then, Takamura realizes that Ao isn't with the group anymore, so he turns to the teacher who is carrying her. But the man was so shaken by the double kaiju attack that he accidentally dropped her while he was running away. Takamura immediately tried running out to go save her, but everyone else held him back because it was too dangerous. Thus, Ao was left alone in the middle of the snow, and as she is slowly freezing to death, her hair begins to turn white, and she hears a voice in her head asking her how it feels to be so close to death after being abandoned by her own people. Ever since Ao ate the kaiju meat and began feeling sick, she had begun hearing a voice talk to her every once in a while, and the voice seems to find the whole situation intriguing. It wants to know what emotions go through the head of a dying human just before they lose their life. Ao thinks about how she feels right now, and she says she really doesn't want to die in this stupid place because there are so many things she hasn't gotten to do yet, and she's scared of what's going on happening to her now. The voice finds all of Ao's emotions amusing because it's exactly what he thought it would be, a mix of fear, despair, regret, and hatred for the people who abandoned her, but Ao stops him on that last one because she doesn't hate any of the others. Takamura and his wife always shared their food with the kids, even though there wasn't always enough to go around. Her teacher is a big scaredy cat, but he always steps up when he is needed, and even Kashiki, who suggested that they should abandon her. He may seem cold-hearted, but he is the one who cries the most whenever a member of the group dies, so she knows he was just looking out for the group's best interests. That's why she doesn't hate any of them. And in fact, she still wants to do all she can to protect them. So she gets up and stands 10 toes down against the kaiju. The kaiju was about to devour her, but at the last second, the second kaiju drop kicks it in the face with a flame attack. And it is then revealed that the voice Ao had been hearing this entire time was coming from the kaiju. It tells her that it is greatly intrigued by the emotions she just shared with him, and he wants to learn more about what human emotions are like, so he would like her to teach him. And as a connection is formed between the two of them, Ao's body begins to burst out in flames, just like the kaiju's. The others see this, and they have no idea what's going on. But from the looks of it, Ao had gotten the bird kaiju on her side, and that's how she became the group's kaiju tamer. Meanwhile, in what's left of the city, a member of Airday is currently surveilling the humanoid kaiju that froze the world over, and it is pretty much just sitting there. The colonel has no idea what the thing wants, but if they are ever going to save the world, then they are going to need to kill that thing. However, just then, the kaiju turns and looks directly at the colonel, which means it must have caught on to his presence, and a moment later, a giant kaiju attacks the colonel and his crew, so the colonel tells Todo Ichika to prepare for battle. Meanwhile, back in Mishima Mall, after Tetsuo bathes, he meets back up with Ao, and she shows him the kaiju that she bonded with. Tetsuo is a little surprised since he has never seen a kaiju that looks like a chicken before, much less one that can produce fire. But Ao explains that it's not a common occurrence. She has asked the kaiju about it before, and it told her that when it first got to Earth, it was originally a normal kaiju, but it ended up taking this form at some point and gained the ability to think for himself. He also named himself Landaman, and he's got a decent relationship with Ao, but he spends most of his time sleeping since it takes a lot of energy to keep the entire mall warm all the time. At one point, Lando yawns, and as a result, one of the towels Takamura was holding gets blown into the air, and after a little while, it is burned to ash in an instant. Takamura is disappointed because that was his favorite towel, but seeing that reminds Ao to warn Tetsuo not to get too far away from her. It may not feel like it, but this cave is actually scorching hot right now, and the only reason they aren't being burned alive by Lando's flames right now is because Ao is controlling the temperature around her body to keep them safe. It's not as powerful as Lando's, but Ao also has the ability to produce and control flames, and that ability is the only reason that they've been able to survive in this frozen world for so long. So Ao believes that the only way humanity can truly come out on top is to get closer to the kaiju, and she promises to protect everyone with the power she has acquired. That said, Ao can't exactly say she completely understands Lando, because he agreed to stay down here and act as the compound's heater, which basically eats up all of his spare energy, and in exchange, all he ever asked for was for Ao to come and read him one book a day. That really doesn't seem like a fair trade to Ao, but Lando seems happy with it, so she has no right to judge. After that, Takamura takes Tetsuo back to his room and explains that this is where he will be staying from now on. Normally, people in the mall share a classroom as their sleeping quarters, but families are granted special exceptions, and that means Tetsuo is now a part of Takamura's family. And speaking of his family, Takamura mentions that there's one more person he'd like Tetsuo to meet, but it looks like his daughter isn't here right now. Meanwhile, Tetsuo is busy looking around the room when he suddenly pulls back a curtain, and to his shock, he sees Takamura's daughter, Hagane, while she's right in the middle of changing, and he inadvertently gets a full view, which is way too much for his socially awkward brain to handle, so he passes out on the spot. Several minutes later, Tetsuo finally regains consciousness, and he finds Hagane looking after him since Takamura had some business to take care of. He is still eager to make new friends, so he immediately gets up and introduces himself to Hagane, and Hagane explains that her dad asked her to look after Tetsuo while he's gone. He also left a letter for Tetsuo and asked her to give it to him once he woke up, and Tetsuo is really happy because receiving a letter from friends is one of the milestones for friendship he read about. Takamura basically wanted to tell him that he would be back later tonight, and until then, he hopes Tetsuo can get along with Hagane. He also asked Tetsuo to keep Hagane away from her mother's workshop, because going there will probably stir up a lot of tragic memories, especially since Hagane's mother died last month. Learning that makes Tetsuo feel bad for Hagane, but she suddenly gets up and asks him if he would like her to give him a tour of the facility. Tetsuo says he's happy to go along with her as long as it's not to the workshop Takamura mentioned. But lo and behold, she ends up taking him to the workshop. She explains that her mother used to be a higher-up in the tech department, so she had her own research and development workshop built, and to carry on her work. Hagane has been using it in secret even though her dad tells her not to. Tetsuo is impressed because Hagane's mom seems like an incredible person, and Hagane is really happy to hear him say that. She recalls how her mother used to praise her inventions whenever she'd show them to her, and she always loved receiving head pats afterwards, so since she finally has someone to show, she asks Tetsuo for his honest opinion on her latest invention. Meanwhile, the Colonel and his team just barely managed to escape that giant kaiju, and they were able to do it thanks to the kaiju they have under their control. But if they want to beat that thing, then the Colonel says they are going to have to integrate the flame kaiju at Mishima Mall into their fighting force, completely disregarding the fact that the people there needed to stay warm. His subordinate also informs him that there are rumors going around that Tetsuo has returned from space with a weakened version of Snowball. And hearing this, the Colonel is filled with anger because he can't believe that Tetsuo didn't end up dead in space as planned. But if he's really back, then the Colonel thinks this is a perfect opportunity to steal both the flame kaiju and the Snowball robot in one go. And once he has the power of both under his control, the V-Erde organization will become the saviors of the world. Back at Mishima Mall, Takamura finally returns home, and he is surprised to find both Tetsuo and Hagane absolutely exhausted, so he asks what they were up to. And Tetsuo is about to tell him that he and Hagane just spent a long time going back and forth on the details of her invention. But Hagane doesn't want her dad finding out about the fact that she was in the workshop today, so she shuts Tetsuo up. Anyway, Takamura brought ingredients for dinner, so using a hot stone, he boils a pot of soup and grills some kaiju meat. But since Tetsuo hasn't adapted to eating kaiju meat like the rest of them yet, Takamura warns him to stick to the veggies because he might end up getting sick. After dinner, they all go to bed on the floor. But Tetsuo is having a hard time going to sleep because he's so happy to finally be doing friend activities. But while Tetsuo is smiling ear to ear with joy, Hagane is having a nightmare of the day her mother died. And it was pretty gruesome because she had to watch as her mother's already dismembered body was eaten by a kaiju right in front of her. Meanwhile, out in the snow near Mishima Mall, there's a kaiju named Artemis who is currently munching on some kaiju brains, and he desperately wants to try eating more humans for a change. That kaiju is bonded with one of the Colonel's subordinates, and it has the ability to communicate over extremely long distances, so he has been relaying information to them as they are on their way to begin their attack. It confirms that both the flame kaiju and the snowball robot are indeed at Mishima Mall, and since that has been confirmed, the Colonel intends to kill everyone there so he can take both for himself. After all, he doesn't care about anyone who refuses to accept his V-Erde salvation. That said, it's going to take them a while to get to the mall, so a week goes by without incident. And in that time, both Tetsuo and Hagane have been sneaking off to the workshop together to work on Hagane's project, and it's finally complete. It's a set of weapons, and Hagane feels incredibly relieved now that it's done because she has been so nervous since she started working with gunpowder. Tetsuo doesn't really understand what she was so worried about, but that's just because with all the fighting he has done, he's already used to working with explosives. On that note, Tetsuo asks Hagane why she was building something like this in the first place, but before she explains, Hagane asks Tetsuo to come a little closer. Tetsuo does as she asked, and Hagane tells him that this is something her mother used to do for her whenever she did a good job, so she'd like to try doing it for someone else. Tetsuo isn't sure what she's talking about, but then Hagane places her hand on his head and tells him he did a good job. This comes as a shock to Tetsuo, and Hagane soon turns beet red because this is way more embarrassing than she thought it would be. So she takes her hand off his head and apologizes to Tetsuo for making him put up with her request. But Tetsuo already passes out from embarrassment. A while later, they are all having dinner as usual, and Hagane thinks to herself that it has only been 45 days since her mother died. Yet she doesn't find it all that strange that Tetsuo is currently sitting in her mother's old spot. In fact, it almost feels like Tetsuo has always been part of the family, but be that as it may, she can't forget about what happened to her mother and the horrible sound of her body being crushed in the kaiju's mouth. So, until she avenges her, Hagane won't be able to rest. Later that night, Tetsuo wakes up and discovers that Hagane isn't there anymore. He realizes she left a letter for him, so he takes a look at it, and he is shocked by what it says. Hagane is currently out by herself with the weapons she made with Tetsuo, and she intends to hunt down and kill the kaiju that ate her mother. The reason she didn't tell anyone else about it is because she knows her dad would try to stop her, but she's starting to regret coming out alone when she comes face to face with Artemis. Artemis is overjoyed because he remembers Hagane's scent, because he had planned to eat her right after her mother, but because Ao and Lando showed up, he was forced to retreat. At first, Hagane was terrified, but when she remembers what this thing did to her mom and what she came here to do, she steadies herself and prepares for battle. Artemis swings at Hagane, expecting to crush her with ease, but to his surprise, Hagane dodges without so much as a scratch, and it's all thanks to the first part of her invention, the anti-kaiju hover boots. They have an automated evasion system built in, so even if Hagane doesn't have time to react, she can still evade its attacks. However, she didn't come here just to run, so she takes out the weapon she developed with Tetsuo. Tetsuo had warned her that something like this wouldn't be enough to kill a kaiju, since even if you gut a kaiju square in the mouth, it would only amount to a flesh wound. But Hagane said that's fine because she doesn't need to kill the kaiju to get her revenge. She fires a rocket right into the kaiju's mouth as it charges at her. And as the rocket explodes, countless little serrated blades she and Tetsuo had made are launched into the kaiju's mouth. Each blade was designed to be impossible to remove, and at even the slightest bit of vibration from the kaiju's vocal cords, the blades will vibrate, causing intense pain. So under conditions like that, the kaiju will never be able to eat again, condemning it to eventual starvation. This is the conclusion of Hagane's revenge, but she didn't really think of a plan to survive after that, so she just falls to her knees and awaits death. However, before the kaiju could swipe at Hagane, Tetsuo and Snowball come zooming by and slice right through the kaiju's arm. Snowball then tells the kaiju to get lost before they obliterate it, and Artemis is left with no choice but to retreat. Now that the threat is gone, Tetsuo runs over to Hagane to check if she's okay, but he ends up tripping and landing right on top of her instead, and in that moment, he says the only thing he can think of and tells her she did a good job by herself, and hearing that brings Hagane to tears because it reminds her exactly of how her mother used to say it. This is a touching moment, but all of a sudden, Snowball senses that something is wrong, so he tells Tetsuo to get back in the cockpit immediately so they can get out of here. But it's already too late for that. The Colonel and his crew are closing in on their location, and even though Artemis was defeated, the Colonel isn't concerned because they've got a whole army of kaiju under their control. And since they are already close enough, he tells arrows to fire, hitting Snowball with a wave of projectiles that blow him up. Back when Airday was first created, Sagami enlisted as a soldier, and he was really good at his job, so much so that he was well respected within the force shortly after he joined. And with his talents, people often called him their savior, a title which did wonders for his ego. As the years went by, Sagami continued to build his identity around his savior complex, and up until this point, everything had been going great for him. But then one day, while Sagami was hanging up one of his latest awards, he saw a news report about how Tetsuo had just killed a kaiju using a newly developed robot, and that was the day everything changed for him. All of a sudden, people were hailing Tetsuo as their savior instead of Sagami, and Sagami couldn't bear the fact that a child like Tetsuo was outshining him, but there was nothing he could do because public favor had already shifted towards Tetsuo. Shortly thereafter, Airday began an initiative to stop sending out foot soldiers altogether and focus on sending troops in mass-produced robots modeled after Snowball. And there were several soldiers who were upset about this decision because it made their jobs a lot less valuable, and Sagami was just as upset as the rest of them. But he was in no position to complain because the higher-ups had already decided that robots were the way to go in the battle against kaiju, and they weren't going to change their minds anytime soon. Sagami tried his best to grow accustomed to operating the robots in hopes of reliving his glory days of being the best of the best. But after trying it in a simulation, he realized that he was painfully average at it. He tried asking the evaluator if there was something wrong with the responsiveness of the machines, but nope, he just wasn't cut out for it. In contrast, in the time since Tetsuo first appeared in the public eye, he had proved time and time again that he was the greatest of all time when it came to operating anti-kaiju mechs, being able to defeat several kaiju all by himself with minimal collateral damage, so he had been solidified as humanity's new savior, and Sagami was left to fade into obscurity as the world proceeded to forget about him. And all Sagami could think of at the time was how much better his life would be and how much attention he would be getting if Tetsuo hadn't shown up. And that's how he developed his beef with a teenager. Later on, there was an incident where 3 giant kaiju appeared in the city all at once, and the ground troops were being sent out to try to minimize casualties while also buying time for the big guns like Tetsuo to arrive, and the fact that Sagami had basically been relegated to damage control really pissed him off. During the mission, Sagami's squad was really only meant to keep the kaiju busy since they didn't have the tools necessary to actually kill the kaiju, but Sagami had other plans, so as one of the kaiju approached, he ordered his men to retreat while he pushed forward in hopes of claiming some of the battle glory for himself. He ran toward the kaiju and began firing his gun at it, and to his credit, He was very skilled with his tactical maneuvers, but his gun simply wasn't doing much damage to the kaiju. However, that didn't seem to matter to Sagami since he was tunnel-visioned on all the praise he would receive once he had killed this thing. However, as the kaiju made its way towards him, before it could attack Sagami, it was body-checked by Tetsuo and stabbed through the head. Seeing this happen infuriated Sagami to no end because he believed Tetsuo had just stolen yet another chance for him to shine, and in a fit of rage, Sagami pointed his gun towards Snowball and pulled the trigger. But it was at that moment that he realized he was completely out of bullets. That meant that if Tetsuo hadn't saved him, then Sagami would have been killed for sure. So really, he should have been grateful. But Sagami had already gone far beyond the point of reason, so he was now going to hate on Tetsuo no matter what. After that, Sagami began to focus strictly on rising through the ranks of the organization so he could amass more decision-making power, and once he had the authority to do so, he called a meeting with all the leaders of Erde and convinced them that it was too reckless for the entirety of humanity's fate to rest on the shoulders of Tetsuo alone. So he proposed that he should be put in charge of an effort to create humanity's next group of saviors, all so he could finally outshine Tetsuo someday. He named the group V Erde, and he was certain they would eventually come to be known as the world's saviors. But then in the year 2034, the Big Freeze happened, plunging the world into chaos almost immediately. At the same time, out in space, the mission to destroy the kaiju nest with Tetsuo had also failed, so Erde had basically ceased to exist overnight. V Erde also faded into obscurity without the backing of Erde, but just when it seemed like Sagami's plan had failed, he discovered an even greater power, the ability to control kaiju with his children, and he planned to make full use of that power to achieve his goal of becoming the sole savior of the world. However, the return of Tetsuo posed a threat to that plan, and he couldn't have Tetsuo become humanity's savior again, so he decided to kill him the second they made contact. Snowball could sense the incoming danger and tried to warn Tetsuo ahead of time, but it was already too late because Sagami's kids had already fired several projectiles at Snowball, blowing half of his body apart. Sagami and his kids all celebrated the successful strike, and Sagami said they were really lucky to catch Tetsuo away from the mall at a time like this because it made their job a whole lot easier. Just then, he noticed that Yuma didn't seem very happy despite their victory, and she said she was just upset because now that Artemis had been defeated, she wasn't going to be able to help the group with missions anymore, and that meant she was useless now. However, Sagami comforted her and said she didn't need to worry because she could just rely on him to protect her from now on. He reminded them all that they were V Erde, and together, they would become the salvation of humanity. But to achieve that goal, first, Sagami had to kill the former savior. He thought to himself that by now, Tetsuo must be wailing in tears over his destroyed robot, and they all began making fun of him. But all of a sudden, Snowball's engines roared back to life, and in one swift motion, he closed the gap and sliced the horns off one of the kaiju. The V Erde group was shocked that Tetsuo had actually managed to recover after something like that, and Tetsuo continued his attack, slicing the head off another kaiju. But then he realized that there were actually people standing on top of the kaiju, and that made him really confused because he didn't understand what they were doing up there. For now, he decided to just kill the kaiju while avoiding all the people, but before he could strike, one of Sagami's kids, Otoichi, proceeded to teleport them out of the way, leaving Tetsuo utterly flabbergasted. Snowball can't wrap his head around what just happened either, because it goes against everything he knows about the laws of physics, but now that they really think about it, there have been a lot of things happening lately which make no sense. It's not like this is the first time he has seen something like this since Lando's powers break the laws of physics as well, but he never could have imagined that something like teleportation was possible. Sagami can tell that Tetsuo is likely overwhelmed by all that's happening, so as a final act of kindness before killing him, he decides to explain how all this came to be. There's a saying that humans only use 10% of their brain, and that if they ever unlock the ability to use their full mental capacity, then they'd be able to access the metaphysical world to use supernatural powers, but that's a bunch of nonsense. No matter how advanced the mind may be, if the body doesn't have the capability of doing supernatural things, then it will never happen. However, when it comes to kaiju, their very nature is supernatural, and the only thing holding them back is their lack of brain power to access their supernatural abilities. So when humans end up creating a link with kaiju, they are able to unlock the latent abilities that lay dormant within them. This information is really starting to freak Tetsuo and Yukio out because if that's really the case, then Tetsuo and Yukio are up against a group of kaiju who each have their own special abilities, and they don't know how to deal with something like that, especially when Snowball is already missing an arm. They ask why Sagami is doing this, but in all honesty, that isn't really important because all that matters is the fact that he is threatening their lives, and that means they have to fight. Meanwhile, back at the mall, Ao and the others are busy goofing off with a couple of chairs in the office, and the others are trying to get Ao to get back to work because they need to finish their work before it gets too late. However, Ao is having too much fun to care right now. But just then, Ao goes silent because she notices something off. She can't exactly put her finger on it, but she can tell that something is terribly wrong in that direction. Meanwhile, Sagami is pretty much tripping on his own thoughts, and he is reassuring himself that there is no way he could lose his battle against Tetsuo. But just to be safe, he plans to have everyone attack Tetsuo at the same time so they can make sure that there's no way he will survive, and after that, they'll head to the mall. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Tetsuo is absolutely locked in because he has already played out every scenario in his head, and he knows he stands no chance of surviving, but he's still going to take out as many of them as he can before he goes. Just then, Sagami gets a feeling that there's something wrong with his plan, so he tells Otoichi to send the orange card signal to everyone because of a change of plans. The others are surprised that Sagami would call for a code orange out of nowhere since it looks like they'd be able to take Tetsuo out no problem right now, but they aren't familiar with what Tetsuo can do when he is backed into a corner. The group begins their advance, and Tetsuo prepares himself for a fight to the death. But all of the kaiju run straight past him because the orange card means they are to ignore all distractions and complete their original objective. So they head straight for Mishima Mall to capture Lando for themselves, leaving just Sagami, Yuma, and Otoichi behind to deal with Tetsuo. Sagami knew that they would win if they attacked Tetsuo together, but at the same time, he knew that Tetsuo would be able to take out at least 3 of their kaiju before they could kill him, so that would have put them at a major disadvantage if they went through with it. That's why he came up with this plan instead. And to make things clear, he tells Tetsuo that the others are going to arrive at Mishima Mall in 4 to 5 minutes, so he needs to catch up to the others in the next 4 minutes. Otherwise, the entire mall is going to be reduced to rubble. But he can't do that until he has defeated Sagami because if he tries to chase after them, Sagami will attack him from behind. 10 seconds go by without Tetsuo moving because he's still trying to figure out what the best course of action is to save the people back at the mall, and Sagami mocks him for being a failure of a savior. But a moment later, Tetsuo lunges forward and attempts to slice Sagami and the kaiju he's standing on in half, but before he could do so, he gets knocked backward into the air. Both Tetsuo and Snowball are in shock because they don't know what just hit them, but it turns out that Sagami has a kaiju of his own as well, and it is extremely powerful, so Tetsuo is going to have a hard time dealing with it. Tetsuo is able to dodge Heracles' first attack using Snowball's booster pack, but Heracles is unbelievably fast and strong, so it's not going to be easy to beat him. For now, Tetsuo is able to more or less keep up with Heracles and parry his sword strikes with Snowball's remaining arm, but not much else, so he asks Snowball to do something. Thus, Snowball activates his secret feature, but it turns out that all it does is make a side-folding chair. 10 years ago, when Tetsuo's father was finishing up the preparations for the space mission, he asked Snowball if he had any special requests he'd like added to his body. That's when he came up with the idea for an inbuilt escape pod that turns into a smaller robot. But on top of that, Snowball also asked for an extra seat to be built into the cockpit because he had hoped that one day, Tetsuo might make a proper friend, and when that happens, he wanted him to be able to invite that friend aboard if he wanted to. There's also a bunch of board games and a takoyaki grill built in here, but that isn't really going to help them in this situation. On the bright side, the extra seat does have some utility, because now that Hagane has fastened herself in, Tetsuo can go all out with his movements. So he parries one of Heracles' sword strikes and proceeds to roll across his sword while slashing his shoulder at the same time. This leaves a deep gash in Heracles' arm, which should limit its mobility from now on, but unfortunately, Tetsuo wasn't able to make it out completely unscathed. As he completed his attack, Heracles managed to kick one of Snowball's legs on the way down, resulting in some severe damage, and if things continue like this, then they'll never be able to win this battle. Just then, Tetsuo notices that Hagane is crying, so he asks her if she's alright, and she apologizes for making a scene when he's so busy fighting, but she feels absolutely awful. She is the whole reason Tetsuo was out here in the first place and got attacked, yet she is completely powerless to help him, so she can't do anything but rely on him to save her. She tells Tetsuo that she thinks the enemy came here to attack with a plan in mind, and if that's the case, then they were probably waiting for 3 AM, because that's when Ao and the others usually go out exploring. That means she is away from the mall right now and unable to protect it if it gets attacked, so Tetsuo really is their last line of defense. He needs to defeat these guys quickly and make it back to the mall in time to stop the attack, but Heracles doesn't seem like the kind of kaiju that will go down quickly, so Tetsuo will never make it in time. He still doesn't know what these guys are after, or why they are attacking the mall in the first place, and with the damage Snowball has already sustained, he is at a severe disadvantage here. So he won't be able to win by sheer force or skill right now, at least not without gaining more information about the enemy. Thus, he comes up with the idea to just ask Sagami directly to see how he responds. Snowball is shocked by Tetsuo's idea, because this is the first time Tetsuo has ever willingly suggested communication, and he sees that as massive growth for Tetsuo's social skills, even if this isn't the best of situations to use them. Tetsuo asks Snowball to turn the external speakers on so Sagami can hear him, because if he can figure out what Sagami's motive is, then he might be able to find a weakness to exploit, or maybe even avoid a battle altogether if he's lucky. Tetsuo has Snowball give a timeout sign to Sagami, and Sagami finds it amusing that Tetsuo would call a truce at a time like this, so he agrees to stop fighting for now. Tetsuo then works up the courage to ask Sagami why he is doing all this, and Sagami says he is simply trying to save the world. Something about the way Sagami said that doesn't sit right with Snowball, so he is starting to wonder if it was a mistake to let Tetsuo talk to this guy. Sagami goes on to say that all he wanted to do was borrow the fire kaiju at the mall so he can use it to take down the humanoid ice kaiju that froze the world over. And Tetsuo takes all of his statements at face value since he has never had to deal with a psychopath before. He tells Sagami that if he really wants to save the world, then there's no need for them to fight since they can work together. And Sagami admits that working with Tetsuo would probably make the job easier. But there's one problem with that. He hates every single atom of Tetsuo's being, and not a single day goes by without him preying on Tetsuo's downfall, so he won't be satisfied until he has killed him with his own two hands. Snowball cuts the transmission midway through Sagami's rant, but the damage has already been done because Tetsuo's morale is in shambles after what his biggest hater just said. People who have trouble communicating with others often put up mental walls subconsciously to keep themselves from getting hurt, and all that hate from Sagami really did a number on Tetsuo's confidence. When Heracles attacks again, Tetsuo can no longer keep up as well as he used to, and before long, Snowball's arm gets damaged, leaving him vulnerable to attack. And at that moment, Heracles slices a portion of Snowball's head clean off, leaving Tetsuo in utter despair. Snowball falls to the ground after the damage he suffered, and under Sagami's orders, Heracles begins stomping on Snowball's body, intending to finish Tetsuo off once and for all. Inside Snowball, Tetsuo and Hagain can see Heracles stomping on them, and it's only a matter of time before he breaks into the cockpit, but there's not much they can do about it. Tetsuo blames himself, because now that he has failed, everyone at the mall is going to die as well. The memories of Sagami calling him a useless failure of a savior start coming back to him, and Tetsuo really doesn't want to think about that in his final moments. So he snaps out of it and activates the last functioning part of Snowball, the booster rockets. He is trying to gain enough height so they'll be outside Heracles' attack range, but as they are flying into the air, before Tetsuo even realizes it, Heracles is already on top of them. It must have seen through Tetsuo's escape plan and jumped at the same time he took off, so he would be on top of them by the time they got into the air. Tetsuo is having a full-on panic attack because he no longer believes he can defeat this kaiju, and defeating kaijus is the only thing he has ever been good at, so if he can't do that, then he might as well be dead. Snowball can see that Tetsuo is in no condition to handle the situation right now, so he takes the controls from him and ramps up the power of the booster jets to intercept Heracles' slash before redirecting himself to headbutt Heracles right in the sternum, stunning him long enough for them to escape past him, although Heracles did manage to graze Snowball a little. As Snowball is flying away, he apologizes to Tetsuo for suddenly taking control without asking him first, and Tetsuo apologizes to Snowball because it's his fault that he suffered so much damage. He should have known that a guy like him has no business trying to hold a conversation with a total stranger like that. He had mistakenly thought that since everyone he had met until now was friendly, it would be the same with Sagami, but that was just dumb luck. He really thought he had grown, and that maybe he could handle things by himself, but at the end of the day, it turns out he hasn't changed at all, because he is still messing up when it matters most, so he never should have tried to go outside his comfort zone like that. Snowball tries to tell Tetsuo that it's not his fault that they couldn't win that battle, and that it wouldn't have been so difficult if they weren't stuck using this escape pod to fight. It doesn't have enough specs or strength to do justice to even a fraction of Tetsuo's strength or skills, so he really shouldn't be blaming himself for what happened. If anything, Snowball thinks he should be the one to blame, because right now, they need to make it back to the mall as soon as possible, but with the current state of his body, Snowball isn't able to generate enough thrust to go at top speed. He's really trying his best to make Tetsuo feel better, but none of what Snowball is saying seems to be getting through to him at all, and if he doesn't think of something soon, then Tetsuo is never going to be able to regain confidence in himself again. Snowball wants to say something like Tetsuo is amazing for stepping up to the challenge of holding a conversation, or that he shouldn't quit because he still has Snowball by his side. But then he realizes that the entire reason Tetsuo is so socially deficient is because Snowball has been by his side since he was young, and his presence is what ultimately drove Tetsuo further into seclusion. He can't bring himself to say such empty words, but he still needs to find a way to help ease Tetsuo's mind before it's too late. Just then, Hagane slowly places her hand on Tetsuo's for comfort, and this surprises Tetsuo a little. But as he looks over at her, he can see that Hagane is scared out of her mind, and she has been doing her best to hold back her tears so she wouldn't distract Tetsuo, but this is all too much for her. She has come close to dying so many times this night, and the threat of having those people potentially destroy everything and everyone she cares about filled her with so much terror that she doesn't know what to do. She has no idea how Tetsuo managed to handle situations like this every day until now, and feeling Hagane's trembling hands reminds Tetsuo that fighting terrifyingly strong kaijus isn't a normal occurrence for most people, and that all the work he has put into fighting isn't completely in vain just because he couldn't beat Heracles. He then bursts into tears alongside Hagane, and Snowball wants to join in as well, so he extends an arm toward them, but then he realizes that this isn't the time to interfere with Tetsuo's moment. Instead, he focuses all his energy on getting them flying back to the mall as soon as possible, so they can get there before those kaijus completely wreck the place and steal Lando. But while they are still mid-flight, something completely unexpected happens because Snowball picks up an incoming transmission. He informs Tetsuo of the message, and Tetsuo is just as shocked as Snowball is because after the big freeze, most of the world's tech and communication networks were destroyed. So how is the message being transmitted, and by who? Snowball doesn't have any information on who is behind sending the message, because all it says is that the message is from an unknown number, and after a short delay, said unknown number seems to have sent an encrypted message addressed to Snowball and Tetsuo. Snowball begins deciphering it, and to his shock, once he is done analyzing the contents of the message, he finds out that it is telling them to stay away from the mall because the kaijus have already arrived and it's too dangerous. But that just raises more questions, because no one at the mall should even have the technology to send a message like this, let alone know Snowball's contact information well enough to send it directly to him. Meanwhile, the kaijus have just arrived at the mall, and the kids are all impressed by the fact that there really isn't any snow here. But that's to be expected when there's a fire kaiju living here. The original plan was to basically destroy everything and claim the fire kaiju for themselves after all the dust has settled, but Tamiya still has a conscience, and he is starting to wonder if this is really necessary since there has to be a more peaceful way to resolve all this, like making the pilot of the flame kaiju join forces with them instead of simply destroying the mall for no reason. However, he is told by the others that they can't do that. The captain's dream is for Viridi to become the sole saviors of humanity, so they can't join forces with anyone, and Makoto agrees, especially since the captain told them they are allowed to kill any of the masses that refuse to acknowledge Viridi as their savior, so civilians are fair game. Tamiya relents and agrees to go on with the mission as planned, so he tells Makoto and the others to spread out and surround the building just in case, so nobody escapes. He then prepares Eris's ability and begins aiming the projectiles at the school. Eris's ability allows it to morph its horns into various different types of projectiles depending on the situation and fire them with insane accuracy. Tamiya plans to bombard the school with so much overwhelming force that the people inside will immediately lose the will to fight, and from there, once the survivors come out and start surrendering, things should go smoothly. He primes his grenades to explode, and once they are all ready, he launches them right at the school's building, resulting in massive explosions all around, but to his and the others' surprise, once the dust clears, the mall is still standing because they had activated an anti-kaiju shield generator that was installed on the roof. Inside, the mall engineers have all gathered in the control room to begin taking countermeasures against the invaders, and the boss is really annoyed since using the barrier so much is going to be a huge waste of electricity, but they don't really have much of a choice here. In the meantime, Takemura is desperately trying to send out a message to Snowball to see if Tetsuo and Hagane are alright, and to his relief, he eventually manages to get through to them. While he's talking, the boss says it's time for them to strike back against the enemy, so they should begin preparing the weapon systems, and outside, Tamiya recognizes the barrier as one of the K2 anti-kaiju barriers that were used by Erde before the Great Freeze. Makoto doesn't understand why a mere school building would have a military-grade barrier, but Nayuta calls him an idiot and explains that the school didn't originally come with the barrier. Instead, it must have been added by some of the engineers who live here in preparation for a potential kaiju attack. But considering the current state of the world, it must have taken them ages to create such strong defenses, and Nayuta is excited to see what they have in store here. The building's armory soon comes online, and several missile turrets emerge from the ground, all aimed right at the kaiju. On the boss's signal, dozens of missiles are fired right at Tamiya, but even with countless warheads heading his way, Tamiya seems perfectly composed because he knows that something like this won't be enough to take him down. He then orders Arrows to make some defensive maneuvers. So Arrow splits its horns into dozens of tiny pieces and sends them all flying right at the missiles, intercepting each and every one of them before they can even get close to Tamiya. On the monitors, the Mishima Mall team can see that all their missile attacks failed, and they are starting to panic a little, but the boss tells them to stay focused and just keep firing. So that's exactly what they do. Meanwhile, Nayuta begins approaching the building from above and starts clawing away at the barrier with his kaiju. So far, the barrier has managed to withstand his onslaught, but each strike does a significant amount of damage to the barrier's integrity, so it won't be able to hold out for much longer. Thus, they decide to target him instead and begin firing at Nayuta, but his kaiju is way too fast and dodges the gunfire before he gets hit. He does the same with the subsequent missile strikes as well, and he is having the time of his life, so he tells the mall to keep the missiles coming. But once they run out of ammunition, it's going to be over for them. And while Nayuta has been busy dodging missiles, the other two just hunkered down and hid because they are nowhere near fast enough to dodge like that. Everything that has happened so far is currently being recorded by a drone which has been flying overhead this entire time. And it also happens to have a view of Sagami and the remaining Virta members as they make their way over here. Otoichi tells Sagami that once they make it over those mountains up ahead, it won't be long before they arrive at Mishima Mall. But then he notices that Sagami seems really upset for some reason. Just then, Hercules stops moving and falls to its knees because it can't keep going anymore. And that's when Sagami screams out in frustration because he can't believe things are turning out so poorly for him. Hercules spits up a ton of blood, and Otoichi is surprised because he didn't think that Attack Snowball landed could have done so much damage to Hercules, but he really seems to be down for the count right now, and Sagami is throwing a full-blown tantrum, though that's something the others are used to by now. Otoichi tells Yuma that once Sagami is done with his tantrum, they can continue heading over to Mishima Mall. And he also doesn't think there's any need to worry about Hercules because injuries like that are nowhere near enough to be fatal to a kaiju. And since Hercules is tougher than your average kaiju, instead of 3 days, he should be back up and running in no time. The camera on the drone then pans over to Snowball, who is still heading towards the mall, and they find out that the drone watching them is actually one of Takemura's inventions. It's a high-altitude drone with a high-def camera which can be used to search for people around the mountain, but it doesn't have much battery life left at the moment, so it won't last much longer. The idea for it was originally proposed by Suzu, his deceased wife, so he had it developed as a final wish. The only reason she even came up with the idea in the first place was because she was worried about Hagane always trying to sneak out of the mall on her own every chance she got. So she thought a machine that could search for her would come in handy someday. When Takemura initially woke up and found Hagane's letter detailing her need for revenge, he immediately booted up the drone and started searching for her all over the place, which is when he managed to spot Snowball in the middle of his battle with Hercules. At the same time, he could see the other kaiju heading straight for the mall, so he immediately alerted everyone so they could evacuate and prepare the defenses. That's the only reason they were able to fend off Tamiya's first attack in the first place, and he's sure that it was only a coincidence that Hagane chose to seek out her revenge on this particular night, but nonetheless, if she hadn't done so and caused Takemura to go searching, they never would have found out about the kaiju attack in time to prepare themselves, so she inadvertently saved many lives today, and Hagane is just glad to know that her dad is still alright. Snowball asks Takemura if he's sure he doesn't want them to head over to Mishima Mall, and he assures them that they'll be able to hold the fort on their own for now. Besides, they've still got that deep tunnel underground as an evacuation point, so most of the others from the mall are already a safe distance away at this point. Now all he needs is for Tetsuo, Hagane, and Snowball to head over to the evacuation point as well, and Tetsuo assumes that must mean there are enemies attacking the evacuees that Takemura wants him to deal with, but Takemura says he just wants Tetsuo to evacuate with the others. After all, it's not like he can keep fighting much longer after all the damage he has already suffered. Not to mention the fact that Tetsuo looks like he has been crying nonstop from how scary all this has been for him. Technically, Tetsuo has been crying a lot, but Snowball clarifies that it wasn't because he was scared of fighting, it's because Sagami insulted his very existence, and even just thinking about it is getting Tetsuo teary-eyed again. Takemura is a little surprised that a few insults were enough to make Tetsuo cry even though he's perfectly fine with life and death battles, but that's not really important right now. So the boss just tells Tetsuo and the others to hurry up and evacuate because they can handle things here on their own. Takemura then cuts off the communication line and turns to the boss, asking if this is really her first time talking to Tetsuo since she seemed pretty heated just now. And she did previously work for Airday too, so she might have met him before, but she refuses to answer that question and instead asks how the evacuation is going so far. She is informed that around 90% of the people have made it out, but they are still in transit to the evacuation point, so it doesn't look like they are going to make it in time. To make matters worse, Takemura reports that they are almost out of power, so the barrier won't last much longer. A few minutes later, the barrier ends up shutting down, and the second it's off, Nayuta and his kaiju grab onto the building and rip out the barrier generator. The boss says they had to use all the electricity they generated from Lando's heat over the course of many years, and now it's all gone, so they have nothing left to fight with. Nayuta is disappointed to hear that since he was hoping to play a little longer, but he tells her that they did pretty well to last this long against their assault. He feels like it would be a waste to just kill them outright when they are so talented, so for now, he decides to keep them as hostages while Rico digs down to look for Lando, since they know he's under the school somewhere. However, despite how hopeless the situation seems, the boss doesn't look scared at all because she knows they've still got a trump card up their sleeve. A good distance away, Ao's friends are panicking by the truck they just crashed into a ditch a few minutes ago. And they can't believe how poor the timing was because they had just received a message from Takemura telling them that the mall is currently under attack, but with the truck stuck, there's no way they'll be able to get it out in time to make it back to the mall. However, Ao refuses to let her home be destroyed, so the second she heard it was under attack, she took off running back towards the mall. After Ao gained her powers, her body became several times stronger than a normal human's, so she is able to run incredibly fast. She blames herself for being away from the mall at such a critical moment because she wanted to goof off and explore, especially since she had sworn to protect everyone with these powers of hers, and she can only hope that everyone there is still alive somehow. When Ao eventually arrives at the mall, she leaps into the air and calls out for Lando to get up and help her fight. And down in the tunnels, just as Rico is getting close to Lando's chamber, she suddenly feels the air become extremely hot. Before she even has a chance to react, she is already engulfed in the flames of the now awakened Lando. And now that Lando and Ao are together, they are going to do everything in their power to stop the invasion. Nayuta isn't too worried about her at first, because there's no way she can attack while he's holding her friends over here hostage. But when he turns back, he realizes that Takemura and the others from the control room are already long gone. He hadn't really planned for that, but he still doesn't think Ao and Lando are much of a threat because even with Rico out of the picture, it's still 3-on-1 kaiju battle, and there's no way they can lose with this much of a numbers advantage. As Ao chases Nayuta away from the building, Takemura and the others come out of hiding and pull up the drone footage so they can see what's going on. Ao is still extremely enraged by the fact that these people would dare to attack a human settlement, but Tamiya and Nayuta couldn't care less about her outrage because they still think their chances of winning here are pretty high. Tamiya aims at Ao and has arrows fire 2 shots, which just barely clip Lando's wings. The shots didn't do any damage, but Ao recognizes that having someone sniping at them from the ground is going to be troublesome, so she plans to do something about Tamiya, but before she can, Nayuta sneaks up behind her and hammer fists Lando into the ground. After hitting the ice, they begin to sink in since Lando's heat is melting it, and the others think this is going to be an easy win since Ao hasn't managed to put up much of a fight yet. But Tamiya tells them to stay focused because the mission isn't over yet. They still need to secure Lando and bring him back with them so they can carry out their mission. Sure, the people who live here won't last very long without their heat source, but that's not really their problem, so they don't care. After all, the only thing they are concerned about is making sure Vierd becomes the savior of the world. When the boss hears the name Vierdi, she suddenly remembers hearing rumors about them during her time at Airday. It was a unit led by a man named Sagami, and though Sagami was a good soldier on paper and got promoted a lot, she started to notice that whenever Sagami was promoted, a lot of his competitors or supervisors would end up having unfortunate accidents. Eventually, rumors started to spread that Sagami had set his sights on taking out Tetsuo next, and at the same time, the anti-Yabusim faction within the force had grown larger, gaining momentum behind the scenes. Not long after that, Sagami's Vierda project was approved, and he was given free rein to use as many little kids as he wanted for his project. Also, he could live out his fantasy of becoming the world's savior, and a lunatic like that is definitely going to be a problem. Meanwhile, Ao and Lando are at the bottom of the ice hole, and as Ao is getting back on her feet, she complains about how unfair this is. It's a 3-on-1 fight right now, and that's not even mentioning the kaiju that are currently closing in on this location, but she's got no choice but to handle this alone. It will be a lot harder to win if Sagami gets here, so she needs to take those three out as soon as possible to reduce her opposition. And if that's what it takes to protect them all, then that's what she's going to do. Just then, a huge pillar of fire erupts from the ice, and the three think it must mean Ao is about to resurface, so Tamiya aims at the hole in preparation. But it turns out that it was just a decoy, and Ao is really melting her way through the ice to get underneath Makoto. Nayuta warns Makoto that Ao is heading his way, but he can't see her under the ice, so he has no idea where to attack. Fortunately for him, he doesn't need to know where to attack, since his kaiju's ability allows it to create giant clouds of smoke and then use that smoke to create a strong gravity field underneath. The gravity field puts a tremendous amount of weight on Ao and Lando, but she still manages to get underneath Makoto's kaiju and stab it with flames to take it out. That's one down, so Ao immediately moves to go after Tamiya, and she is so fast that she catches him off guard. Before he knows it, both he and his kaiju have been engulfed in flames, so now Nayuta is the only one left. Meanwhile, Tetsuo and Hagane have just arrived down in the bunker, where they meet up with all the other people who evacuated there. They soon spot Takamura's friends nearby with Joji, and Hagane is extremely relieved to see that her little brother is okay. The guys offer to go get them some sleeping bags and rations so they can get settled in, but before they leave, they tell Tetsuo that they heard he was out there fighting for them earlier, and they want him to know that they are really grateful for that. Tetsuo is happy to receive their praise, but he is also a little conflicted because all his life, he has been told that his worth comes from the fact that he can kill kaiju, but he was told to evacuate. So right now, he feels like he's not really doing anything. He decides to start thinking about potential dangers to watch out for, and that's when he notices that the ice ceiling here is pretty thin, so if those Virta guys came looking for them, they'd be able to get in here pretty easily. He'd like to think of a way to prepare in case of an eventual attack, but it's not like he can do much with Snowball's current condition. However, just then, Tetsuo and Snowball spot a giant 3D printing machine as well as a ton of scrap and parts from one of the original Snowball robots. He can't believe all this stuff is really here, but the others explain to him that this place used to be a research facility, so they've got a bunch of tech stored away. Though, it's not like it does them much good since they don't have the electricity necessary to use any of the equipment. And that 3D printer is the worst of all because it consumes so much electricity that the last time they were able to use it was when they were first building the defenses for the mall. Tetsuo believes he can use this to fix Snowball, so he will be able to fight again, but there's still the major problem of figuring out a way to actually power this thing. Snowball considers using his power core to run the printer, but that would likely drain his power reserves completely, which would defeat the whole purpose of fixing him in the first place. But just when things look hopeless, one of the mall residents walks by while holding one of the generator bikes they use to generate power there, and that gives them an idea. They gather all the generator bikes in one spot and enlist the help of as many able-bodied people as possible to pedal in order to generate enough power to run the printer, and thanks to their combined effort, it looks like the printer is up and running again, so Snowball should be good as new in no time. Meanwhile, outside, with two of the enemy kaiju already down, things are looking pretty good for Ao, but she still hasn't dealt with Nayuta yet, and while she wasn't paying attention, he sneaks up on her and kicks Lando, launching him toward the mall. Lando manages to regain his footing before he crashes into the mall, but then Nayuta lands in front of them, and this is apparently the exact situation he had been hoping for. Now that both of them are on the ground, he doesn't need to worry about flying anymore, so he can activate Ares' predation posture. Ares has two forms as a kaiju. One is a weaker, lighter form that allows him to fly, and the other is a much bulkier form that grants him enhanced strength and superior combat ability. Nayuta is certain that like this, there's no way Lando and Ao will be able to beat him in close quarters combat because there's no way Lando's flames can burn through all of Ares' muscle in time before he gets to them. However, Nayuta made a grave miscalculation. Lando doesn't simply produce flames. He has the ability to manipulate a unique kind of heat energy, and by gathering that energy into a small enough area, he is able to greatly increase its power. So when Ao eventually throws the energy ball, it immediately tears through Ares' body with no issue, killing it on the spot. With this, Ao has officially defeated all the enemy kaiju present, but just as she's about to start celebrating her victory, a light appears behind her because Sagami and his crew have just arrived, and he had Otoichi teleport him right behind Ao. Sagami then orders Hercules to slash Lando, resulting in a deep cut along his wing, which sends a sharp pain into Ao's arm as well. Sagami also warns Hercules not to go too far because they need Lando alive, and they wouldn't want to accidentally end up killing him by stabbing his heart. Lando refuses to let himself be taken, So he breaks free of Hercules' sword and performs a flaming spin kick in an attempt to knock Hercules back, but Hercules simply dodges his attack and punches Lando across the face. Both Lando and Ao realize that they would be at a major disadvantage in close quarters combat, so they try to create some distance so they can launch some fire blasts at Hercules. Even if the fire blasts aren't enough to take Hercules down immediately, Lando believes they should scare Sagami enough to make him retreat. However, after the fire blast dies down, Hercules remains standing completely unharmed, and Sagami is also perfectly safe because Otoichi had teleported him into Hercules' mouth to protect him from the flames. While in there, Sagami doesn't need to worry about getting burned at all, and Hercules is way too durable for Lando's flames to have any effect on him, so there is no way Sagami can lose now. Hercules then stabs Lando again and begins pummeling him alongside Ao, and it looks like all hope is lost because so far, he has had an answer for everything Ao and Lando have thrown at him. Lando tries telling Ao to use the concentrated fire blast again since it might be able to get through Hercules' skin, but somehow, Sagami is able to repeat exactly what they were thinking, and he refuses to give them even the slightest chance to recover, so he starts pummeling them even harder than before. Ao and Lando don't understand how Sagami could possibly have known what they were thinking, but he clearly did, and now that they are completely helpless, Sagami proceeds to knock Lando out and grab Ao. He doesn't want to let her die so easily because he wants to make her suffer for taking out his subordinates. Now that the battle is almost over, Otoichi teleports over to Sagami to congratulate him on a great victory because now the flame kaiju is theirs for the taking, and they will finally be able to use it to defeat that humanoid kaiju and save the world. Ao thinks it's a sick joke for Sagami to say he wants to save the world when he is such a villain, and thinking back on everything he has done in pursuit of his goal to surpass Tetsuo, he finds it hard to refute her statement. He's a psychopath, not delusional, so he admits that he is indeed quite villainous, but he doesn't see anything wrong with it since he can't afford to be picky about the methods he uses. Just then, Sagami's cheek gets grazed by a bullet from the boss, and she says she totally could have killed him just now, but her aim sucks because she's way too old for this stuff. She tries shooting again, but now that Sagami knows she's aiming at him, he has Otoichi stop the shots. He doesn't want to let anyone stand in the way of his plans again, so he tells Otoichi to just kill them immediately, and that's exactly what he's about to do with his kaiju. But just before they can be eaten, Tetsuo and Snowball land just in time to squash its head into the ground. The repairs on Snowball are finally complete, so he should be able to fight much better than last time, but Snowball asks Tetsuo if he's sure he really wants to do this after what happened last time. Tetsuo admits that what Sagami said really hurt, but he is also aware of the fact that most people aren't like Sagami, and if he closes himself off because of a single incident, then he will never be able to make friends, so he wants to face him again. Sagami is surprised that Tetsuo actually managed to repair Snowball, but he is grateful that Tetsuo came back because now he gets a chance to kill him with his own two hands. However, it may not be as easy as Sagami thinks it's going to be because the scraps he used for the repairs were of pretty high quality, so along with his upgraded arm, Tetsuo also created a weapon for himself, meaning he should be able to fight much more efficiently now. Tetsuo is angrier than he has ever been before right now, and this is a first for him because he has never experienced emotions like this, so Snowball is a little worried that he may get carried away. The others have managed to make their way onto the mall's roof, and Takamura is sure Tetsuo can beat Sagami now, but the boss tells him it's not guaranteed yet because those repairs don't look very solid. They'll just have to hope that they can hold out until Tetsuo beats Sagami. The people down in the hideout manage to tune in thanks to the drone, and they are also worried that the repairs might not hold out since they basically just stuck some parts from the scrap pile onto Snowball, especially Hagane, who is praying Tetsuo and Snowball make it out of this alive. Sagami is extremely jealous of Tetsuo right now because coming back to fight after completing repairs is classic savior behavior, but he doesn't think that hunk of junk is anywhere near enough to beat him. Though, at the same time, Hercules still hasn't fully recovered from the beating he took earlier, and he has his hands full with Lando and Ao right now, so it won't exactly be easy to face Tetsuo as he is now. Thus, he decides to make a strategic retreat to get to higher ground first. Once Sagami gets up there, he finds Yuma with the four who were defeated by Ao, and thankfully, they are all still alive. Their clothes have been burned off, and the shock from their kaiju link being severed as the kaiju was burned up knocked them out, but other than that, they are fine. Sagami is glad to hear that, so he asks Yuma if she still has her gun on her, and Yuma proudly tells him that she always stays strapped, just like he taught her. In that case, Sagami hands Otoichi and the others over to her and says he is leaving her in charge for now, but that gun probably won't be enough to stop Ao if she regains consciousness, so to be safe, Sagami breaks a few of Ao's bones first. Tetsuo is absolutely enraged when he sees this, so he lunges forward, trying to save Ao. But Sagami drops Ao into Yuma's arms and knocks Tetsuo back. Tetsuo lands back on his feet, and for the first time, he understands what it truly means to hate someone, so he swears that he will make Sagami pay for this. He then charges back in against Sagami, and Hercules instinctively dodges, but now Tetsuo and Snowball have a weapon at their disposal to extend their reach, so they are able to swing at Hercules' neck even after he dodges. Hercules has no choice but to block the attack, but with the extra power from the arm booster, Snowball manages to overpower Hercules and send him off balance. He immediately follows it up with another axe swing to the neck, which Hercules dodges at first, but then Tetsuo activates the axe's extension function, and the axe head suddenly shoots out from the handle. Hercules manages to dodge this as well, but it knocks him severely off balance, and Tetsuo takes full advantage of that to throw a full power punch right at Hercules' head. This would be impossible for any normal person to dodge, but since Hercules is a quadruped, he is able to launch himself backwards using his hind legs. Sagami hadn't anticipated that Tetsuo would be this tough with a scrap pile like that, so he begins retreating, but Tetsuo isn't letting him get away so easily. He tells Snowball to reel the axe head in, and as he does so, the axe head flies straight back, chopping the top of Hercules' head clean off. In Tetsuo's career as a kaiju fighter, he can't say he has never lost a fight against a kaiju. But he most certainly has never lost twice because he learns from his mistakes and adapts to come out on top in the end, and right now, Sagami is experiencing that firsthand. To finish him off, Tetsuo throws a powerful punch right at Hercules' chest. To Tetsuo's shock, Sagami somehow predicts that and opens Hercules' second mouth just in time to avoid being hit. Sagami admits that he was in some serious trouble back there, and if he didn't have access to Hercules' supernatural power, then he most certainly would have been knocked out. He then tries to bite down on Tetsuo's arm, but Tetsuo manages to dodge in time, and after putting some distance between them, he tries launching the axe head at Hercules again. Sagami sees this coming as well and has Hercules catch the handle. He then begins trying to pull Snowball in, but Tetsuo cuts the rope and flies in, attempting to headbutt Hercules like last time. However, this fails as well, because just before impact, Hercules jumps backwards under Sagami's instructions, so no damage is dealt. Snowball can't believe Sagami was able to perfectly time the jump just as they charged in, but Tetsuo corrects him and says he thinks Sagami actually prepared to jump before they even started the headbutt. Tetsuo and Hercules proceed to exchange a few more blows, and after all that, Tetsuo has finally confirmed that Hercules must somehow know what he's going to do in advance. He assumes it must have something to do with his supernatural power, but he still isn't sure how it works. He asks Snowball to pull up all the footage he has gathered during the fight with Hercules and put it on screen because he wants to analyze it to figure out whether Hercules has a weakness. Snowball thinks it's a little reckless for Tetsuo to start analyzing footage while also actively fighting for his life, but it's not like they have much of a choice right now. Sagami knows Tetsuo well enough to realize that he is probably trying to figure out a way to counter Hercules' power right now, so he plans to finish this before he can do that. Right before Tetsuo throws another punch at Hercules, Sagami activates his power, allowing him to view fragments of the future. With the way the power works, each possible future outcome appears as a fragment, and Sagami is able to choose his next actions based on the outcome they will lead to. By doing this over and over, if there is even a slight chance of victory for Sagami, he can just keep peering into the future until he finds one where he comes out victorious. However, this power does come with one major drawback. Using it to look any further than 10 seconds into the future takes a huge toll on Sagami's body, so he normally isn't able to keep this up for very long, but if he wants to defeat Tetsuo, then he can't stop until he finds a timeline that guarantees him victory. All of this happens inside Sagami's head, so from Tetsuo's perspective, Sagami suddenly begins perfectly parrying all of his punches with Hercules' hooves out of nowhere. Sagami is ecstatic because, although it caused some damage, he finally found the perfect way to defeat Tetsuo after looking 74 seconds into the future. And now all he needs to do is follow the sequence of events to win. He then begins exchanging blows with Tetsuo all the way down until they reach the ground, at which point he slams Tetsuo into the snow. Tetsuo then begins spinning to try to get Sagami off him. But this too was part of Sagami's prediction, so he jumps off before he gets knocked off. And just as Tetsuo launches Snowball's arm as a surprise attack, Sagami dodges midair before closing in for a final slash, which Tetsuo has little hope of dodging. But just before the blade actually hits Tetsuo, Sagami suddenly gets hit in the face by the drone. This was a completely unexpected turn of events, and the ones behind it were Ao's friends, who had snuck into the control room during all the chaos and taken control of the drone. They weren't sure if it would do any actual damage, but they still wanted to do something to fight back, and they can only hope it helped, if only a little. Sagami wasn't able to see that drone coming, and because of that unexpected hit, he made an unnecessary movement. But fortunately for him, the timeline he saw is still intact. So as long as he doesn't make any more mistakes within the next 10 seconds, it should all go as planned. However, what Sagami didn't account for was the fact that Tetsuo seeing that drone slam into Hercules' head was the final piece of the puzzle he needed to figure out how Hercules' ability truly works. However, he can't say it out loud because if he does, then Sagami will be able to find out that he knows. Sagami then proceeds to throw the axe head toward Mishima Mall, but Tetsuo jumps in front of it to block the strike, and this is what leads to the final countdown before Sagami's guaranteed win. Tetsuo still hasn't been able to tell Snowball how to counter Sagami's ability, so all he can do is look Snowball in the eyes and let go of the controls, hoping that he will get the message. At that very moment, Sagami begins the swing that was supposed to take Snowball's head off the second Tetsuo tried to dodge it, but to his shock, unlike in his prediction, Tetsuo doesn't try to dodge at all, and the strike ends up passing over Snowball, leaving Sagami in utter shock. Earlier, Tetsuo realized that Sagami's ability couldn't possibly allow him to see the entire future. Otherwise, he never would have been hit by that drone, or by Snowball's headbutt back then. And the only common factor between both incidents was the fact that an inanimate object was responsible for the hit, which is what led Tetsuo to believe that Sagami's ability only allows him to see the actions of living people, and that he uses information from Tetsuo's actions to predict how Snowball will move. However, with Tetsuo letting go of the controls, his prediction of Tetsuo's actions becomes completely useless. That also means that as long as Snowball is the one in charge of fighting, Sagami has no way of knowing what he's going to do next, and that leaves him completely defenseless. So Snowball proceeds to headbutt him at full force. The headbutt does so much damage that it causes Hercules to spit up a ton of blood, and Sagami tries to predict the future again by looking at Tetsuo's actions, but Tetsuo isn't doing anything right now, so Sagami is still clueless as to what comes next, and he gets hit by yet another headbutt. Sagami is really starting to panic now, so he throws out a wild attack in an attempt to catch Snowball off guard, but Tetsuo takes control back to dodge it, and even though Sagami will be able to predict his next move now, Tetsuo doesn't think it will matter because, with the injuries Hercules has suffered, there is literally no way for Sagami to dodge this next strike. Sure enough, when Sagami tries to look for a way out, he is faced with the reality that there is no future where he wins anymore, and now all he can do is curse at Tetsuo in anger and frustration. The insults still hurt Tetsuo, but he understands that he has to be able to handle people not liking him if he ever wants to make friends, so he powers through it and uses the axe to finish Hercules off.